Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on a Friday night to learn more about our current exhibition, Origins, Collecting to Create the Nelson-Atkins. We're so glad to see so many of you here today. My name is Tara Laver, and I'm the Senior Archivist for the museum, and I had the pleasure of being one of the co-curators on the exhibition. So I just want to mention a few housekeeping things before we get started. You can choose the view that you use during the meeting, speaker or gallery, depending on your preference. We do have captioning enabled. If you'd like to take advantage of that accessibility feature, it's there for you. Just click at the bottom, the CC button there at the bottom for you. And then finally, we want to sort of, since this event we originally had hoped would be in person in the gallery, but we're not able to do that tonight. So we wanted to try to make this a little bit as interactive as we can. So please feel free throughout the evening to drop in comments in the chat, as well as questions in the Q&A. We'll monitor that and try to take questions during our presentations as we go. But do please kind of keep that distinction, chat for comments and Q&A for questions, because that'll make it easier for us to see the actual questions. And that is our housekeeping bit. I will toss it to William Rudolph, who is Deputy Director of Curatorial Affairs, and he will introduce our panel tonight. Thanks, William.
Thank you, Tara. Good evening, everyone. We're so glad you could join us on this chilly evening. I am joining you from a virtual recreation of the block galleries, which I chose because not just are they beautiful, but also it's kind of closer to the end of our nearly 100-year story that we continue to tell every day. But tonight, you're going to go back in time, as I hope you've done visiting the show, to how it all began, to our origins. Now, you've met Tara, our senior archivist, one of the co-curators of the exhibition, and it is my great pleasure to also introduce you to my colleagues, Dr. Kimberly Masteller, the Jean McCrae Beals Curator of South and Southeast Asian Art, and also Mackenzie Mallon, who is our specialist in provenance. And with that, sit back and enjoy learning about how it all began in Kansas City and around the world. And let me welcome Mackenzie. Thanks.
Thank you, William, and welcome to everybody who is attending tonight. I just want to start by saying thank you to all of you. If you have seen Origins already, we're just so grateful for your continued support of our programs, especially during this time. This project has meant a lot to us, and we're really excited to continue to share it with you this evening and over the next few weeks leading up to its closure on March 6th. So if you haven't had a chance to get down to the gallery yet, we hope that tonight's event will encourage you to get down there and take advantage of the space. So I thought I would start with just a really brief overview of the exhibition, just kind of a lay of the land especially for the overarching themes of the exhibition. And then we're going to each take a few moments just to kind of talk to you a little bit about some of our favorite moments in the exhibition. And like Tara said, we really encourage you to ask your questions throughout in the Q&A, because that is what we're really hoping is going to drive our conversation this evening. So just as the overview, you can see here a couple of photographs from the exhibition space, and I've tried to place myself in there. I think we all have to place ourselves virtually in that space tonight since we can't be there in person. But Origins, Collecting to Create the Nelson-Atkins, it really was designed to explore the beginning of the museum's collection. So we're focusing on the objects themselves. And we're doing this through a consideration of the really earliest acquisitions that were made for the Nelson-Atkins collection. And we had several goals through this exhibition. We wanted to first and foremost emphasize the cultural and the chronological variety of the early collections, that the very first objects in the collection, right from the very start, were coming from many different cultures and time periods. We also wanted to place the first acquisitions for the Nelson-Atkins within a historical context, and specifically that context would be in the very early 1930s. So we're thinking about the Great Depression and what was going on in the world at that time and how that influenced the ability of the museum to collect, not only how they collected, but what they collected. And we wanted to introduce some of the people who shaped the museum's earliest development through the staff, through their advisors, and through agents. And so you'll hear a little bit about some of them tonight as well. And one of the funnest parts, at least for me, of this exhibition was that we were able to do all of this primarily using objects that are not always on view in the galleries, that you haven't maybe seen in a while. We had the opportunity here to bring them up and to put them out again, and hopefully reintroduce our visitors to some long lost friends, if you will. So Tara, could you go ahead and give me the next slide? Thanks. So I'm going to start by talking about the very first section of the exhibition. And there were 4 sections, roughly, that we've broken the exhibition down into. But this very first section really looks at those very first acquisitions for the collection. We're looking here at specifically objects that came to the Nelson-Atkins through our participation in archaeological excavations. And you can see that in the photograph on the right. On the far right, that case over there against the wall, you see the famous brick, which if you've attended any of our other events related to this exhibition, you'll know that this brick that comes to us from an archaeological excavation in Iraq was the very first object acquired for the museum. And this really show-stopping raven mask that is in this large case in the center of the gallery space. And on the far back wall, you'll see a couple of portraits. These are part of a group of the very first purchase of European paintings that was made for the Nelson-Atkins collection. And they came to us from a local dealer, a local art dealer named Yunt Art Galleries. And it was really an opportunity for our founders to make a connection with the Kansas City market and the Kansas City community, and show their to show how important it was to them that they make those local connections. But for me, one of my very favorite moments in this very first section is the moment that you see here in the photo on the left. Now, if you're coming into the exhibition space in the block galleries, you're coming down the ramp and you're going to turn right into that gallery space. And in the photo on the left, you'll see that you are first presented with this big open wall that has these 2 very commanding Renaissance paintings on it. These paintings are actually copies of famous paintings that hang today in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. And I find these copies so intriguing because they are, in a way, a connection to our founder, William Rockwell Nelson, and his very earliest ideas for creating an art museum in Kansas City. So in 1896, William Rockwell Nelson went to Florence as part of a trip that he took to Europe, and he bought 19 copies, painting copies of famous artworks from a shop there in Florence. He brought them back to Kansas City, and he gave those 19 copies to the city of Kansas City as kind of a first art museum. And this was in 1897. So you're thinking 33 years before the Nelson-Atkins opened its doors. So it really was it wasn't really the beginning of the Nelson-Atkins, because they were 2 totally different collections, but in a way it was a precursor. And this collection was called the Western Gallery of Art. Tara, could you have the next slide, please? Thanks. So this collection, the Western Gallery of Art, was put on view in the Kansas City Public Library. And they were all copies of they were modern copies, so copies made in the late 19th century of European old masters. So 19th century copies of famous paintings that had been made in the primarily 16th century. There were also some sculptures included. These you can see in the photograph on the left, some plaster casts of famous classical and Renaissance sculptures. And the exhibition of copies of sculptures in this way was not unusual in museums in America. You can see on the right a photograph of the plaster cast court at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston from the same period. But the exhibition of copies of paintings was not as common. This was something that was a little bit more unusual to display an entire collection of painting copies in one group in a museum style setting. So I think that's what really intrigues me about this. And you can see a little image right there at the top of your screen. We have an original copy of the catalog that was made of these copies of the Western Gallery of Art copies. And that catalog is in the Origins exhibition. You can see it there. Next slide, please. So Nelson acquired all of these copies from this gallery called Pisani Gallery in Florence. And you can see a photograph of that on the left. And I'm really interested in this gallery because they sold both copies of old masters, but they also sold contemporary Italian art. So works by contemporary Italian artists. And we think that some of these contemporary Italian artists were probably studying at the Pisani Gallery in a kind of academy. And they would go to the museums in Florence and they would copy the famous paintings and then as kind of a study tool. And then they would bring them back to the Pisani Gallery and they were sold to finance the gallery, to finance their studies. We're not 100% sure exactly how all this worked, but it's very intriguing to me how they did all of this. But of course, we know that at the Nelson-Atkins, our early trustees decided to collect original art instead of copies like the Western Gallery of Art. And so next slide, please. So when the Nelson-Atkins opened its doors in '33, the Western Gallery copies did come to the museum here, and you can see a photograph of them installed here on the right. But they were never formally accessioned into the collection. So they never officially became a part of our collection, and they were only on view for about 10 or 11 years. But it's exciting to me to have the opportunity to bring two of them out again in Origins and to explore just the very beginnings of art museums in Kansas City through these two really, really beautiful, beautiful copies, right down to the frames. The frames themselves are handmade and just gorgeous. So I hope that you'll have a chance to look at them in the gallery space. So that's one of my favorites. Are there any questions that we can take at this time? Please feel free to use the Q&A box. And if not, then I'm going to throw it over to my wonderful colleague, Dr. Kim Masteller. Kim?
Oh, thank you, Mackenzie, and thank all of you for joining us on our virtual gallery talk. And so imagine, if you will, we're going to walk into the next set of galleries. Next slide, Tara. And this section, as Mackenzie told you, talks about the more of the people who helped us build the collections. And so the trustees of the museum were businessmen. They weren't experts in art or art history. And so they engaged consultants to help us determine what to buy. These people were agents for the Nelson Gallery. So we call this next section Agents of Acquisition. And we focus on three people in this section. Harold Woodbury Parsons, who worked as an agent for the Nelson-Atkins from 1930 up to 1953. So he had a long impact on our collections here. Parsons was an expert in ancient art, European art, and American art. And he helped us acquire many works here, including the 18th century high chest, which you see in the upper right displayed next to his picture in the exhibition. Two other figures were very important to our history. Langdon Warner, who you see in the center, he was a huge legendary figure in the field of Asian art history and archaeology. And here you see him in the field where a fedora, a shovel in hand, he's excavating in Central Asia in this photo. He was a Harvard professor, a curator at Harvard's Fogg Art Museum, and the Nelson trustees coaxed him somehow to also be a consultant for our museum. Next to him on the left is another man, Lawrence Sickman. And you see, Warner was a very busy man. So on a buying trip for the trustees in China, he invited his former Harvard graduate student, Sickman, who happened to be studying in Beijing at the time, to join him. And Warner was really impressed with Sickman's knowledge and connoisseurship, and so he soon recommended him to perhaps serve as boots on the ground as our main consultant in China. We've got an audio clip here. Tara, if you want to play, Sickman will tell you about his work with, and this arrangement.
I hadn't been there less than a year when I had a letter from Langdon Warner, who had been my professor and mentor at Harvard University, saying that he was coming out to do some buying, and would I meet him in Peking. And when he arrived, he told me that he had been asked to be advisor, Far Eastern Field, to a projected museum in Kansas City. I'd never been in Kansas City before, but he said, no, they're building a museum and they want an Oriental collection, and they've asked me to be of some assistance. So they'd given him some money, and he'd been to Japan and bought some things in Japan, and was then in Peking to add to the Oriental, see what Chinese things he could acquire. At that time, I had only been in Peking, let us say 6 months. I had never visited any of the big dealers. I had no idea of the art market in Peking, although it was the center of the art market in China. But anyway, we batted around together at visiting the dealers and Langdon bought a few things. But when he left, when he came back to America, he had some thousands of dollars left over, and this he deposited in the Peking branch of the the City National Bank, and said, now when you find something really good, drop me a line or send me a photograph, and perhaps we can acquire it. So that's the way things started.
What a story. Next slide. Moving to the next gallery, we introduce you to more people in the collecting story of the Nelson-Atkins. This section is called Enriching the Collection. And so while these first agents were hard at work, the Nelson trustees and staff are now looking to expand the collection further. In this gallery, we'll show you works of art associated with some new people and new sources. These include works acquired through C.T. Liu, probably a familiar name to many of you now who visited the exhibition or attended some of our other programming. C.T. Liu was a famous early dealer of Chinese and Asian art based in Paris, with also a branch in New York City. We featured the story of how we acquired the Persian mosaic arch you see in the upper right in the gallery as well, which we acquired through the consultant Arthur Upham Pope. And we'll share works with you like this 16th century Dutch altarpiece in the lower left, acquired from the Durlacher brothers in New York. And this was a gallery, some art dealers who approached the museum in 1926, the trustees, before they were even able to buy, offering to set up a sole partnership where they would be our primary source for artwork. That would have been a great deal for them. We didn't do that, but we got some great works of art from them. Next slide. And then the exhibition turns its attention to local Kansas City collectors and patrons. And so going back to our premise for the gallery talk, when we were thinking about what we would do tonight, and this was before we even knew we would be doing this on Zoom, Mackenzie, Tara, and I were talking, we wanted to tell stories we haven't told before, and perhaps deeper dives into works of art or behind the scenes kinds of things. So the story I chose to talk about is a little bitty work of art that was a gift from a great Kansas City patron, Mrs. Ella Luce. And you see her in this portrait by Howard Chandler Christie on the left. But what I want to draw your attention to is that little inlaid cigarette case on the right. In the museum, this piece came in with very little cataloging information associated with it and nothing to tell us where Mrs. Luce got it. It just has a broad attribution of African ? So in preparing this exhibition, we wanted to see if we could do a little better than that and at least narrow this object's origin down to a specific country or tradition rather than just speculating on a continent. Next slide. So one art historical approach that we use in museum work is to examine a work and look for comparisons that are known. So similarly decorated inlaid boxes made during the 19th and 20th, early 20th centuries, which is what our case is, are made in quite a few places around the world, actually. India in the top center, Turkey in the bottom center. You see they both share kind of a interest in kind of geometric pattern and inlay work. We also see mother of pearl inlay like this in Africa, particularly in Egypt and Morocco, and that's an Egyptian box in the top right of your screen. And if you look at the Luce case, again, on your left, you'll see that it's decorated with these little boxes in the design that almost look like they have shapes in them, similar to cartouches that you might see if you looked at ancient Egyptian artworks that have hieroglyphics and kind of like little text boxes. That was an unusual feature of this. So does that suggest this is Egyptian? Or perhaps the case is meant to reference ancient Egyptian art in a contemporary work? So while researching 19th century Egyptian inlaid boxes, we found works like on the bottom right. However, that one's from England. It's an example of Victorian Orientalism. And like our case, it's a product made for consumers with global tastes in a global art market. Next slide. So we thought the next phase of work is to see if Mrs. Luce's biography could help us narrow this down. So thanks to the great research of Michelle Valentine in the South and Southeast Asian Department, we learned that she and her husband, Mrs. Luce and Mr. Luce, were frequent international travelers, and they made 2 trips to Asia. Here on this map, which is on view in the Weaving Splendor exhibition, we trace the route of one of her journeys. Her ship traveled across the Pacific to Japan. And if you notice it, if you follow the route of her voyage, it passes through the Suez Canal, it stops in Egypt, and it may even stop in Morocco. It certainly passes out of the Mediterranean. So with all this work, we got just a little bit closer. And so we've now identified the piece instead of African ? As Africa, possibly Egypt or Morocco. And that's how one little thing can create a whole lot of work and not always get you to a final answer. And now I'll hand it over to Tara. Next slide.
Thanks, Kim. Yep.
Yes, sorry. I was so excited to get through that story, but I'd be, if anyone has any questions about this or this section at this time, we can take them now too.
Nice sleuthing, Kim and Michelle.
A great example of just how what so often Mackenzie and I refer to as going down the rabbit hole of trying to find the answer to something and how frustrating it can be when you don't find a definitive answer. But some markers that point you in the right direction. So, oh, we have a question. Let me see. Somebody asked, could you talk more about how often female collectors shaped the collection? I'm actually about to start on that topic a little bit, but then feel free, Mackenzie and Kim, to jump in with anything else after I talk about, you know what's coming, but you know, if there's anything else that that you want to add, we can please do after I get started. All right, so I will go ahead with that. So Kim got us into this a little bit with Ella Luce, but I'll set the scene a bit more for the section that the Ella Luce materials are in, which was titled Friends in Kansas City. And you can see the gallery shots there at the right, and there is Ella in all of her glory at the end of the vista there, and the cigarette case and the seed pearl necklace that Kim showed us are in that case there, along with additional jewelry there from another female collector. Then behind or next to that, you see another Kansas City connection through some of our Native American objects that were acquired through the Fred Harvey Company based here in Kansas City that had what am I trying to say? Cafes and sold food for passengers who were coming through on the trains, and expanded out far to the west, and that's how they developed an interest in Native American objects, and actually had created a museum in Albuquerque that had an abundance of riches, and they decided to sell some of their collection, which we acquired. So you can see that there in that part of the gallery. And then down on the bottom, you see just the end of the exhibition, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the objects here in detail in a little bit. But before I do that, I want to draw your attention back to the left-hand side of the slide and talk a little bit about Frances Logan. So much of what we've been talking about so far has taken us around the world to China, Iran, Europe, and Africa. But this section, as I said, brings it home back to Kansas City, focusing on the support that the people of Kansas City provided to the museum. And this was both institutional support and individual. Institutional in the form of the Friends of Art, and individual from the many local collectors like Frances Logan. Many of these local collectors were women who gifted objects to the museum. So Frances Logan left this painting that you see here on the slide, Beachside, to the museum upon her death. An active patron of the arts, she served on the first board of governors for the Friends of Art, and she purchased Beachside through the local art teacher and dealer named Effie Seacrest, who encouraged her mostly women clients to acquire works of modern art. So yes, we are getting into the ladies now. We're very, just this connection between Effie and Frances and some of the other female collectors in the museum. We were glad to be able to highlight that. So I mentioned Frances Logan's connection to the Friends of Art, and you may already know, but Nelson's will prohibited the use of his funds from being used to purchase works of art from artists who had not been dead yet for 30 years. And with his affinity for old masters, he wanted to sort of make sure that the art that his money bought had stood the test of time, in his opinion. So he had put that prohibition in his will. But the museum staff and museum supporters soon realized what a disadvantage that was for a new museum. And so in 1934, they got together and formed the Friends of Art, which was an organization where people paid dues to be a member. And then every year they would select a work of modern or contemporary art to purchase and donate to the collection. Their first purchase was Thomas Hart Benton's Sun Treader, which you see there at the end of the vista, again at the bottom right photograph. And something that we haven't touched on too much here tonight, but that I want to call out, since I am the archivist and it's how I got involved in being one of the co-curators, is that we've told all these stories through the art, but also through archival documents that we have that help us know what we know about these objects and how they came to the collection and their backgrounds. So here we've featured next to the Thomas Hart Benton painting, a facsimile of this letter from DJ, what's his last name? I forget his last name, D.L. James, who was chair of the committee that selected the works that the Friends of Art would then vote on to decide which one they were going to donate to the museum. And he's written this letter to Maynard Walker Galleries in New York, who represented Thomas Hart Benton. And I'll just call your attention to the second paragraph because I think it kind of nicely ties things together. He says, "It seems particularly appropriate that our first choice should be a work not only of a very fine painter, but one who belongs to this part of the country." So again, we have all this global art, and then also bringing it home, having local artist Thomas Hart Benton represented. Let's see, next slide. And then, as Mackenzie and Kim have done, I also want to share sort of one of my favorite moments in the exhibition. And it is found in this section, on the Friends of Art. And it relates to Brazilian artist Irene Hamar. Irene Hamar came to the United States with a traveling exhibition of her sculpture shown at the Nelson-Atkins in May of 1943. This was just one stop on a tour of her exhibition across the United States. I think there were maybe 10 other museums. Brazil had sponsored this tour as a part of a cultural exchange among allies during World War II. Brazil happened to be the only South American nation to join with the Allies in World War II. But her work was so popular that a group of museum supporters, together with the Friends of Art group, gathered donations to purchase this sculpture for the collection. And as we saw in the photo before of this space in the gallery, it's right there at the end. And I just really love this sculpture. I just being in its presence is really, it's so serene and graceful and just beautiful. I think all of us, whenever they installed it, everybody just kind of stopped for a minute and looked at it. It's really impactful. Besides that, though, I also love the story that's behind it because I am a history nerd. So I love the connection to the museum's history during World War II. But the story doesn't stop there. So Irene Hamar's daughter, Diane Ashley, shown here with her son, Matt, in the top right photograph, had contacted the museum a few years ago to learn about her mother's wartime exhibit here. And as the archivist, I fielded that query for her. So when Mother was selected to be in Origins, I just sent her an email and let her know that it was going to be in the display, on display. And she made plans to come from Florida to see it. What we didn't know about the sculpture is that it is of her grandmother, Irene Hamar's own mother, whose name was Maria Kiss Hamar. And this was actually the first time that Miss Ashley and her son had seen it. So that was really special to be there when they saw it, and to have a hand in bringing them together with this wonderful, wonderful sculpture. In addition, Miss Ashley brought some of her mother's archives, which she let us scan. And among them was this photograph of Irene Hamar working on a sculpture of Diane, her daughter, which was one of many that she made of Diane. So I really like how it kind of all comes together full circle, where we have the mother sculpture, and then now we've learned about this series that she did of Diana and have this photograph of it. And then Hamar had another fun Kansas City connection that I'll mention briefly. She had met her future husband, Henry DeVries, while in New York. And he was about, again, this is during World War II, and he was about to ship out as an officer in the Office of Strategic Services, which was the forerunner of the CIA. And so since he was about to ship out, he came out to Kansas City while she was here for her exhibition. And they got married at the Jackson County Courthouse by a justice of the peace. So just kind of really, she was from Brazil. He was born in Colombia, but living in New York, and they somehow ended up getting married in Kansas City. So that's just a story that has we've enjoyed learning and sharing with people as part of this exhibition experience. So now you know the rest of the story on that one. And then finally, the last stop is our visitor response station. And this is where we give visitors the opportunity to let us know what they thought about the exhibition. And we'd love for you to take a minute to drop some comments about the exhibition if you've had a chance to visit it. But specifically, we were thinking about how a lot of what we talk about in the exhibit is how the collection was sort of a creature of its time, being collected during the Great Depression, and the tastes that were predominant at the time, and the tastes of the people who were involved. So what we wanted to know was, if you were going to create a collection today, what would you want to see in it? So feel free to drop some of that in the chat as we start to transition to our question and answer section. And I see we have some comments and some questions. So I will go ahead and look at those, and we'll get those started. But before I do that, Mackenzie or Kim, did you have anything you wanted to add about the female collectors who helped shape the collection?
I just wanted to add really quickly that I dropped into the chat a link to the absolutely fantastic Google Arts and Culture exhibition that Tara put together on the women staff members at the Nelson-Atkins who really shaped the early years of the museum. They were just so influential in the beginnings of the collection, and we don't always learn a lot about these early staff members. And so I really would encourage you to follow that link and find out a little bit more about who they were and how they were influential.
And I was just going to say the same thing. In this early period, women may not have had the job of director, at least until World War II, but women in Kansas City played a very prominent role, and we're learning more about that every day.
And I will just add too, she was a collector in her own right, but also was something of an agent for us, is a woman named Frances Bieber, who went by the nickname Biba. And she was one of Sickman's compatriots during his student days in China. And she acted as a bit of a finder and agent for him. And she especially brought furniture and textiles and jewelry into the collection. And there is a case in the section with Sickman that shows a photograph of her, as well as some of the jewelry that we acquired through her. So yes, there were some women who had a hand in creating that early collection. So the next question is, do you have any information on Margot Pete? So I happen to know that and I'm going to put this in the chat. Margot Pete was a local artist, and she's actually has an entry in our Missouri Remembers project, which I've just dropped the link to in the chat with her, where you can link to the biographical entry, about her. So please take a look at that. Let's see. Another question is, were there any particular challenges in organizing this exhibition, considering that there are so many different cultures and time periods represented?
Kim, as our resident curator, do you want to take a stab at that one? How do you put together an exhibition that encompasses such a broad range of cultures and periods?
The short answer is yes. In fact, we had such a large possible checklist to draw from. We began to narrow the show down by time period because we thought of taking it further into, through World War II, maybe to the mid 20th century, because there's so many stories. And we realized that we needed to tighten our focus, but then that still left us with hundreds of potential objects. And so once we identified our 4 kind of sections and themes, that really helped us try to choose what might be the best representations or works that told the best story. And we tried very hard to diversify this because it's a universal collection, a global collection. And so we wanted to try to represent that diversity and that richness in the show. So that was very intentional, but it was a challenge. I hope that is seen as an effective approach, but it's where we landed, and boy, we could do many shows like this, I think, and tell many more stories.
Tara, I'd be happy to answer the question that was entered in the chat about the copies and the fact that they're not actually a part of the collection. So it says, back to the Italian paintings, the copies. The Nelson owns them, but they aren't part of the collection. Please explain. That's true. So when a work of art is brought into the official collection of the Nelson-Atkins, it goes through a process called accessioning. And it's a very long, complicated process that requires a lot of paperwork. But this collection of copies was never formally brought into the official collection of the museum because the earliest trustees who were building the collection and who were responsible for making the acquisitions really wanted to put together a collection of originals. However, this collection of copies, called the Western Gallery of Art, was so beloved by Kansas Cityans that they knew that it had to be in some way a physical part of the early museum. And so they agreed to take the collection and move it over to the Nelson-Atkins because it was really running out of space in the Kansas City Public Library. They brought it over here and put it on display in a completely separate gallery. And then something happened. Kansas City visitors to the Nelson-Atkins were overwhelmed by the quality, the variety, the just beauty of the collection of originals that was being acquired for the city. And the collection of copies took a little bit of a step back in people's estimation. But something else was also happening. They were creating some confusion amongst the visitors. We even have some letters in the archives from visitors who write to the museum and say, I was at your museum last week and I saw a painting by Raphael, and I saw a painting by Veronese, and I saw a painting by Titian. And then my friend told me that all of those paintings are copies. Is that true? And as it turns out, no, the Raphael was one of the copies from the Western Gallery, but the others were originals that were part of the Nelson-Atkins new collection of original works. So having that collection of copies on view at the same time as the original works in the Nelson-Atkins collection was creating a lot of confusion. And so that's one of the reasons why it was taken off view. But no, it was never actually brought into the official collection. So I hope that answers the question.
One of our other questions says, I'm curious about what echoes of origins you see in the museum's collecting practices moving forward. Would it be possible to learn more about how acquisitions and donations work today and what influences those choices? If it's, Kim and William. Yes, I see William uncloaking. So
Excellent.
Let me address that. It's a wonderful question. So from the beginning, as I hope you'll already have realized from the presentation and also from visiting Origins, the museum had encyclopedic ambitions. It really truly wanted to bring the world to Kansas City, which is why we sent people out into the world like Mr. Sickman and Mr. Warner and others. And we have continued along those lines. So we still collect the arts of Asia. We still collect European art, both fine and decorative arts. We still collect American art. We still collect African art. We still collect Native American art. In fact, we have now become, one of the great collections of Native American arts in this country. And also, as we have grown, we have come on board with other types of art that were not part of the original collection. So in particular, photography. We now have about 15,000 photographs and counting that stretch all the way back to the beginnings of the medium and keep going through tomorrow. And also, we do collect contemporary art. And my colleagues mentioned the hesitation on the part of the trustees, thanks to William Rockhill Nelson's will, about contemporary art, which Friends of Art remedied. Well, now we do collect contemporary art. So like every museum, we evolve and keep up. When we acquire works of art, whether it's acquisitions or gifts, we think really carefully about how would the work play in the collections? What does it complement? Does it take us in a new direction? We think about the quality of the work of art offered to us. We think about whether this is something that is a sort of a standalone moment, or whether this helps, whether we're thinking horizontally or whether we're thinking vertically in terms of the strengths of collection. Every acquisition is different. There's no one hard or fast answer, but I do think also there is, of course, the art historical research that all of the curators do, and there is the aesthetic reaction that the curators have, because all of our curators are experts in their field. They have studied for years and trained, and they look at things and they read and we all live with objects at the museum that we know day in and day out. So we're always thinking about, how does this add to that story, the story that began in 1930 with the acquisition of a brick from modern day Iraq. So it's a long-winded way of saying that the process is still continuing. It involves research, it involves conversations, it involves thinking, and ultimately demonstrating to our director, to our collections committee, and to our board why this work should come into the collection, whether it's a gift or whether it's a purchase, because we want to do our diligence to ensure that if it enters the Nelson-Atkins collections, it is something that we want to share and that we want to live with. Kim, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I think that's a terrific summary. I agree that, because the museum defined itself very broadly and globally from the beginning, there are many paths that we could collect in that continue to grow and strengthen in these areas. And then there are areas that we can develop that weren't fields at the time, or maybe weren't recognized by art historians. I would say there's even, tension between what we have, some of the things that you've seen in this show, especially, like Mrs. Luce's objects, you don't always see them on view because they are a little bit out of character. A small box that somebody would carry around maybe in their purse doesn't always play well with Caravaggio. They're very different types of things. And so how do you create conversations and explore them? And so the field of art history, we were all trained to start with a masterpiece as your model and move out. It's kind of an old discipline in some ways. And so things that fall between these, it's very interesting to research them or to look at them because we're looking at at them in ways that these objects weren't looked at even 50 years ago.
Yeah, and I'd like to say we have 40,000 objects. Those are 40,000 stories. Every object tells at least one story, if not an infinite number of stories. And part of the fun, I think, of certainly for me, and I know my colleagues, of being a curator in a museum, but I would hope part of the fun for visitors as well, like yourselves, is to discover these stories, to create your own story of your encounter with the artwork. And I think one of the odd silver linings of the last 2 years for us, with the curators finding projects from our own collections like Origins to look backwards and forwards, or through Weaving Splendor, or through Castles, Cottages, and Crime, and certainly our engagement with local art through testimony, is to really think about the different kinds of stories that we can tell and that maybe we haven't told. And I think it's inspired us all to tell more stories. I think we've learned that we could have a really good time just prowling through our collections and discovering new ways of looking at things that we hadn't thought about. I mean, I'm going to say run, do not walk to see Weaving Splendor, because I think it's all reminded us that, of the centrality of textiles to art history, but also the magnificent examples of creativity across cultures that these Asian textiles tell us. And we're not able to show them that often because of either their size or their light sensitivity. But I think all of us, I don't think, I know for myself, it's hard now to think about, the decorative arts without thinking about the role of textiles in them.
I would just want to throw out, I'm looking at some of our questions, and I think we also got one by email earlier. Mackenzie, do you have that one?
I do have that one. Yes. Tara, do you have a slide for that, I believe? Yes. So the question was sent to us via email ahead of time, that the visitor had attended Origins and seen this particular painting, and was curious about it because the label for it on the wall talks about how it was acquired as by an artist named Velasquez. But in the interim, over time, research that our curatorial staff does increases our understanding and our knowledge of the artists themselves and the schools and the influences they have around them. And we learn a little bit more about the artists working during that period. And sometimes we come to the understanding that a particular work of art is by a different artist than what we may have originally thought. And that's the case in this particular painting. So although it was purchased as by Velasquez, we actually now attribute it to a painter by the name of Herrera the Elder. And the question from the visitor was that she had understood from the label that it was acquired through a man named Maxwell Blake. And she wanted to know a little bit more about who Maxwell Blake was and the connection between him and the fact that the painting was acquired as one artist and is now considered to possibly by a different artist. Maxwell Blake is, he was originally from Kansas City, and he served as a foreign service officer for the Department of State. And most of his career was spent in Morocco. So as Kim was talking about the cigarette case from Mrs. Luce, I was reminded of this story because Maxwell Blake worked in Morocco. He was, during his time as an agent there, a foreign service agent in Morocco from about 1925 to about 1940, he also was in contact with the Nelson-Atkins first trustees and some of our advisors. And you know how they say that it's always about who you know, and it's a small world. Well, if we think that it's a small world in the museum field or in the art market today, it was even smaller back then. And certainly the early trustees and our agents knew Maxwell Blake because he was from Kansas City and there was a personal connection there. And Maxwell Blake himself had connections with people of influence in Spain and in France. And we wanted to acquire works by Spanish artists. And so we reached out to him and he was able to find some private collectors, especially in Spain, who wanted to sell some works from their collection. And so that's one way that this particular painting came into our collection, because he put us into touch with a private collector who wanted to sell their work. As far as the fact that it was by a different artist, I don't really have a reason for or a connection to the reattribution of the painting to Maxwell Blake itself. I think that the determination of the artist, the name of the artist was actually made not by Blake, but by experts that our earliest agents went to, outside experts, other curators at other museums or at other universities, to get their opinions about who the artist was. And you know, these things do change with further research, but I hope that tells you a little bit more, visitor, about Maxwell Blake and how he worked with our collection as an agent for us, a network for us in Morocco and Spain.
So we're getting close to the end of our time. I will, so we've got a few questions that we haven't gotten to yet, but I'll just go ahead with the next one. So what were the most popular objects with visitors when the museum opened? That's a good question. I think it's a little hard to answer maybe, but I think there are a few things that we do know. Mackenzie, do you want to talk about the masterpiece of the month, and then I'll talk about the Van Gogh story?
Yeah, sure. I don't know how much I have to say about the masterpiece of the month, but certainly when we see newspaper clippings from the earliest years of the Nelson-Atkins, we see a lot of press coverage over what was called the masterpiece of the month. And there was a dedicated gallery on the main floor of the museum that was used only for the display of a single object, and that rotated every month, and it was called the masterpiece of the month. And the staff usually would submit a text describing that object to the local press, and it would kind of be an opportunity to celebrate a new acquisition or a really significant piece in the collection. And so I think there was probably a lot of hype around whatever the masterpiece of the month was going to be. And because it changed so frequently, people often came back to the museum on a monthly basis to see whatever that new masterpiece was for that particular month. But just to go on from that just a little bit, the fact that the masterpiece of the month changed every month is fascinating to me, because it wasn't just the masterpiece of the month. It was actually many of the works in the galleries were rotating almost constantly. The early staff, we don't know how they did it. They were very busy bees, and they were constantly rearranging the galleries and moving things around. So there was always something new to see at the museum in the earliest years.
I know too, oftentimes the masterpiece of the month was something that was recently acquired. So it was a way to garner interest in it early on in its life here at the museum. And then I know something that really made an impression and continues to, it was the Chinese Temple Gallery. That was something that people talked about a lot and connected to. But I also just wanted to share quickly a story where visitors or people in Kansas City had a direct hand in the acquisition of a work. F.E. Seacrest, one of our art agents, Harold Woodbury Parsons, teamed up with F.E. Seacrest, who I mentioned earlier, is one of the local art teacher and dealer, to advocate for the acquisition of Van Gogh's the Van Gogh that we have now, Olive Trees. And the trustees were kind of on the fence about acquiring this. It did, unfortunately for Van Gogh, fall in. It was okay to purchase with Nelson funds because Van Gogh passed away early. He did fall within that 30-year rule. But still, the trustees were really on the fence about it. And it was on display in a space at the Kansas City Art Institute before the museum opened. And FEC Crest actually got a petition to the trustees to get them to acquire it, which they ultimately did. So that was one that had some strong interest from the beginning for it to be acquired for the museum, and continues to be a favorite. So I know we didn't get to all of the questions, but I really thank you all so much for your interest and your participation tonight. I hope that even though it was virtual, that you felt like it was a little more interactive and conversational, and they got to learn some of our favorites. I am going to just share with you as we close out one of the other fun things that's in the gallery. And so thank you again so much for joining us. I hope it inspired you to come and see Origins again, if you've seen it, and to come if you haven't, before it closes on March 6th. So we're going to give a toast to the origins of the museum, which I don't know if you see, I have my little vintage Nelson Gallery glass. Just like some of the people in this video were toasting and partaking. So I'll play us out on this film that is featured in the exhibit. There's no sound, so don't think that you're missing out on anything. But the film shows art dealers Paul and Margot Malon's visit to Kansas City in 1937. They were dealers based in Paris, and they came through in 37 and were feted by museum supporters at parties. And what you'll see in the video in the beginning is Margot Malon on the train, and then she's walking on the grounds with our first director, Paul Gardner, and Lawrence Sickman. You'll get to see Paul Gardner's dog, Biff, and just some of the folks who were partying with the Malons back in 1937. So we hope that you all have had a good time tonight too, just like it looks like they did back in 1937. So thank you all so much. And oops, we will see you in the galleries, hopefully.
All right.